Hey guys, welcome back to the Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled people's story. This whole mess started about 3 years ago when I bought this unique property that had 2 houses on it. The main house where I live is pretty nice with a huge detached garage, and there's a smaller rental house on the back of the lot. At the time, gas prices were starting to climb, and I work from home doing IT consulting, so I thought having rental income would be a smart financial move. What I didn't expect was the nightmare tenants I inherited with the property. Let me back up a bit. When I bought the place, the previous owner was this sweet elderly man who'd owned it for decades. He told me the tenants in the back house, Carol and Bob, had been there for over 10 years and were no trouble at all. He painted them as these wonderful, quiet tenants who always paid on time. I figured keeping good tenants was better than starting fresh, so I honored their existing lease agreement. Carol drives this massive SUV that probably gets about 8 miles to the gallon on a good day. From day one, she had this attitude like she owned the whole property. She'd make comments about how things were different with the old owner, always with this condescending tone like I was some young kid who didn't know what I was doing. The first few months were relatively peaceful, but I started noticing little things. Carol would complain about me working late because she could see the lights on in my home office. She'd make snide remarks about the plants I chose for my garden, saying they didn't match the neighborhood aesthetic. Her dog would do its business on my front lawn, and she'd just walk away without cleaning it up. I'm generally pretty laid back, so I let these things slide. I figured she was just adjusting to having a new landlord, and eventually we'd find our rhythm. Boy, was I wrong about that. The real trouble started this past spring when gas prices really shot up. I've got this classic Mustang that I work on as a hobby, and it needs premium fuel. I also keep a backup generator in the garage along with several 5-gallon containers of fuel for emergencies. With prices going crazy, I'd started buying fuel in larger quantities when I found good deals. One Saturday morning, I decided to take the Mustang out for a drive. I'd filled the tank the weekend before, but when I got in, the fuel gauge showed it was almost half empty. I thought maybe the gauge was acting up, or I'd misremembered how much was in there. Classic cars can have quirky fuel gauges, so I didn't think much of it at first. A couple weeks later, we had a brief power outage during a storm. I went to start up the generator and found that one of my main fuel containers was nearly empty. I distinctly remembered filling it up completely just a few weeks earlier. There was no sign of a leak on the garage floor, no smell of gasoline, nothing that would explain where 5 gallons of premium fuel had gone. That's when it hit me. Twice in 1 month, fuel had vanished from my locked garage. I wasn't dealing with evaporation or faulty equipment. I was dealing with a thief. The problem was proving it. The garage has a side door that connects to the main driveway, and while I have security cameras covering the front of the property, none of them had a clear view inside the garage itself. I needed concrete evidence before I could do anything about this. Being in IT, I know a thing or two about surveillance equipment. I ordered a small, high-definition, motion-activated camera online and carefully concealed it inside the garage where it had a perfect view of my fuel storage area and the Mustang. I also set up a little test to make the evidence even more damning. I bought a brand new 5-gallon container, filled it with premium fuel, and placed it right in the camera's line of sight. As an extra touch, I placed a single strand of my own hair across the cap. If someone tampered with it, I'd know for sure. Then I waited. It only took 3 days for the camera to pay off. When I checked the footage, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. There was Carol, clear as day, using what looked like an old key to let herself into the garage through the side door. She looked around cautiously before pulling out a siphon pump and expertly transferring fuel from my new container into one of her own. The video quality was crystal clear. It showed her face, her actions, and even caught the license plate of her SUV visible through the garage window. She was obviously experienced at this, working quickly and efficiently like she'd done it many times before. But here's where the story gets really interesting. As I was reviewing the footage and getting angrier by the minute, I had a light bulb moment. I pulled out the rental agreement file and checked the dates. Carol and Bob's lease was up for renewal in exactly 2 months. That's when I realized I had the ultimate leverage over them. They weren't just stealing from some random neighbor they could avoid forever. They were stealing from their landlord, and their housing situation was completely dependent on my goodwill. Instead of confronting them immediately, I decided to have a little fun with this situation. If Carol wanted to steal my fuel, I was going to make sure she got exactly what she deserved. I went to the cheapest gas station in town and filled up several containers with the lowest octane regular gasoline they had. For good measure, I added some fuel system cleaner to the mix. Nothing harmful or illegal, just a commercially available product that's known to cause rough idling and poor engine performance when used in large quantities, especially in older, high-mileage engines like the one in Carol's gas-guzzling SUV. I set up my next batch of bait fuel and waited for Carol to strike again. Sure enough, within a week, the camera caught her making another midnight visit to my garage. This time she was stealing the doctored fuel, and I couldn't have been happier watching the footage. The results were immediate and hilarious. A few days later, I was working in my front yard when Carol came over to the fence to chat. She started complaining about how her car had been running terribly lately, sputtering and stalling at traffic lights. She blamed it on the gas station down the street, saying they must be selling watered-down fuel. I put on my most sympathetic face and told her how awful that sounded, suggesting she might want to try a different gas station. The whole time I was fighting back laughter, knowing exactly why her precious SUV was acting up. Over the next few weeks, I let Carol continue her little thievery operation while I documented everything. Each time she stole fuel, I made sure it was the cheap, doctored gasoline that would make her SUV run worse and worse. Her complaints about car troubles became a regular source of entertainment for me. Meanwhile, I was preparing for the final confrontation. I had weeks of video footage showing repeated thefts, and I'd calculated exactly how much fuel she'd stolen over the months. More importantly, I had leverage that Carol had no idea about. 2 weeks before their lease was set to expire, I sent Carol and Bob a formal letter requesting a meeting to discuss their lease renewal. I kept the tone professional and businesslike, but I imagine it made them nervous to receive such formal communication. The meeting was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon at my house. I set up my laptop, connected to the big TV in my living room, and prepared a detailed presentation of Carol's criminal activities. I also prepared what I called the invoice, a comprehensive bill for everything she'd cost me. When Carol and Bob arrived, they seemed relaxed and confident. Carol was even a bit pushy, talking about how they deserved a rent reduction because they'd been such good tenants for so long. She made some comment about how the previous owner never bothered them with formal meetings and paperwork. I let them talk for a few minutes about the lease renewal before I shifted gears. I told them that before we could discuss extending their lease, we needed to address some serious violations of their rental agreement. Carol immediately got defensive, insisting they'd never violated anything and demanding to know what I was talking about. That's when I dropped the bomb. I calmly explained that the most serious violation was unauthorized entry into my private garage and theft of my personal property. Carol's face went red and she started sputtering denials, claiming I was making things up to get rid of them. I simply said I had evidence to refresh their memory, and I hit play on the video. Watching their faces change as the footage played on the big screen was absolutely priceless. The smug confidence drained away and was replaced by pure horror as they watched crystal-clear evidence of Carol's repeated thefts. The video showed her face, her actions, the stolen fuel, everything. There was no way to deny what was right there in front of them. When the video finished, I paused it and explained their two options in the calmest, most businesslike tone I could manage. Option 1 was simple. I could send these video files directly to the police department with a single click. Breaking and entering plus repeated theft would definitely result in criminal charges. Carol would have a criminal record, and they'd probably face jail time on top of that. Option 2 was what I called the civil resolution. They could pay for what they'd done and leave quietly. I had prepared an itemized invoice for all damages and costs. The invoice was a work of art. I'd calculated the full retail value of all stolen fuel at premium prices. I added charges for a new security camera system, having all the locks rekeyed, and what I called a property security violation penalty. The total came to just over $4,000. But the real kicker was the last item on the invoice, a non-negotiable notice of lease termination. They had 60 days to pay the full amount and vacate the property. No exceptions, no negotiations. Carol and Bob sat there in stunned silence. You could practically see the wheels turning in their heads as they weighed criminal charges against paying up and moving out. Bob finally spoke up and asked if there was any way they could work out a payment plan or stay on the property. I told them the terms were completely non-negotiable. They could pay the invoice and leave, or I could call the police right then and there. Those were their only two choices. After some whispered discussion between them, they agreed to my terms. Carol looked like she was about to cry, but Bob seemed to understand they were getting off easy compared to what could have happened. They signed the lease termination agreement and promised to pay the invoice within 30 days. The next 2 months were deliciously awkward. Every time I saw Carol, she looked like she wanted to disappear into the ground. She'd gone from acting like she owned the place to skulking around like a guilty teenager. Bob started doing all the talking when they needed to communicate with me about anything. I watched them load up a moving truck on a rainy Saturday morning. Carol tried one last desperate plea, saying they'd learned their lesson and promising they'd never cause any trouble again. I reminded her that the terms were final and non-negotiable, just like I'd told them from the beginning. They paid the invoice in full and left exactly 60 days after our confrontation meeting. I used that money to install a state-of-the-art security system covering the entire property, including motion sensor floodlights and cameras with smartphone alerts. Finding new tenants was surprisingly easy. A young family with 2 small kids fell in love with the rental house and were thrilled to have such a responsive landlord. They've been model tenants ever since, and they actually appreciate living on a property with excellent security features. The whole experience taught me a valuable lesson about being too trusting with tenants, but it also showed me that sometimes patience and planning pay off better than immediate confrontation. Carol was so focused on stealing a few dollars worth of gas that she ended up paying thousands and losing her home of over a decade. She thought she was being clever, sneaking into my garage in the middle of the night to siphon fuel, but she never stopped to consider who she was actually stealing from. She got greedy and careless, and it cost her everything. The best part is that my new tenants actually asked about installing their own security cameras for extra peace of mind. They love the fact that the property is so well monitored and secure. It's funny how what Carol saw as an opportunity to steal, my current tenants see as a feature that makes them feel safer. Looking back, I'm almost grateful this happened. It taught me to be more careful about tenant screening, showed me the importance of having good security systems, and proved that sometimes the best revenge is simply letting people face the natural consequences of their own actions. Carol got exactly what she deserved, and I got something much more valuable than the stolen fuel. I got peace of mind, better security, and the satisfaction of knowing that crime doesn't pay, especially when you're dumb enough to steal from your own landlord. But this story isn't quite over yet. The real karma was still coming. About a month after Carol and Bob moved out, I got a call from my insurance agent. Apparently, Carol had filed a claim against my homeowner's policy, alleging that I had somehow damaged her vehicle by providing contaminated fuel. She was claiming thousands of dollars in engine repairs and wanted my insurance to cover it. I couldn't stop laughing when I heard this. Carol was actually trying to get me to pay for the damage caused by her own theft. The insurance agent seemed confused about the whole situation, so I offered to send over the security footage and documentation from our little conflict. A week later, my agent called back. He said he'd never seen anything quite like it before. Not only was the claim being denied, but they were considering whether to report Carol for insurance fraud. Apparently, filing false claims is a serious crime, and she'd made the mistake of putting her lies in writing. The insurance company's fraud investigation team reached out to me for copies of all my evidence. They were particularly interested in the video footage showing Carol's repeated thefts. It turns out they take attempted fraud very seriously, especially when there's clear evidence of criminal activity. Meanwhile, my new tenants were settling in beautifully. The family had 2 young kids who loved playing in the backyard, and the parents were always polite and respectful. They paid rent early every month and even offered to help with minor maintenance tasks around the property. The contrast between them and Carol couldn't have been more obvious. Where Carol had been entitled and pushy, these folks were grateful and considerate. They actually thanked me for having such good security on the property, saying it made them feel safer with their children. About 2 months after the insurance incident, I ran into Bob at the grocery store. He looked embarrassed when he saw me, but he came over to talk. He told me that Carol's SUV had required a complete engine rebuild after all the problems it had been having. The repair bill was over $6,000, and their insurance wouldn't cover it because they determined it was due to improper fuel usage. Bob admitted they knew what had caused the engine problems, and he seemed genuinely sorry about the whole situation. He said Carol had convinced him that taking a little fuel here and there wasn't really stealing since they were long-term tenants. He realized now how wrong that thinking was. I told him I appreciated the apology, but actions have consequences. He nodded and said they'd learned an expensive lesson about respecting other people's property. He also mentioned they were struggling to find a new rental that would accept them without good references from their previous landlord. That conversation actually made me feel a bit sorry for Bob. He seemed like he'd been going along with Carol's schemes rather than being the mastermind behind them. But at the end of the day, he was an adult who made his own choices, and those choices had consequences. A few weeks later, I found out through neighborhood gossip that Carol and Bob had ended up in a much smaller, more expensive apartment across town. Without the affordable rent they'd been paying at my property, they were apparently struggling financially. The engine repairs on top of moving costs and higher rent had really hurt them. The best part came about 6 months later when I received a letter from the district attorney's office. They were pursuing criminal charges against Carol for the insurance fraud attempt. Apparently, the insurance company's investigation had turned up enough evidence to warrant prosecution. The letter asked if I would be willing to testify about the theft incidents if the case went to trial. I immediately said yes. After everything Carol had put me through, I was more than happy to help ensure she faced the full consequences of her actions. The criminal case ended up being resolved with a plea bargain. Carol pleaded guilty to attempted insurance fraud and received 2 years of probation, community service, and was ordered to pay restitution to the insurance company. She also had to attend some kind of ethics counseling program. During this whole process, I learned something interesting about Carol's history. When I was gathering documentation for the insurance fraud case, I found out that she'd had similar conflicts with previous landlords and neighbors. There was a pattern of entitlement and boundary violations going back years. The previous elderly owner of my property had apparently been too nice to confront Carol about her behavior. He'd let her get away with using his garage, borrowing tools without asking, and generally treating his property like her own. When I took over and actually enforced normal landlord-tenant boundaries, Carol couldn't handle it. This explained why she'd felt so comfortable stealing from my garage. She probably thought she still had the same informal arrangement she'd had with the old owner. But instead of talking to me about it like a reasonable person, she decided to just take what she wanted. My new tenants, meanwhile, had become model residents. They kept their part of the property immaculate, never caused any problems, and always communicated respectfully when they needed anything. The dad had even helped me install the new security cameras, and we'd become genuinely friendly neighbors. The contrast really drove home how much Carol's entitled attitude had been poisoning the whole situation. With respectful tenants who understood basic boundaries, being a landlord was actually quite pleasant. I realized that Carol's behavior hadn't been normal tenant stuff that I needed to tolerate. It had been completely unacceptable from day one. About a year after the whole fuel theft saga began, I decided to expand the security system even further. I installed cameras covering every inch of the property, upgraded all the locks, and even added motion sensor lighting around both houses. The new security setup cost almost exactly what Carol had paid me in her settlement invoice. It felt like poetic justice to use her money to protect my property from future thieves and troublemakers. Every time I checked the security system on my phone, I remembered how satisfying it had been to catch Carol red-handed. The fuel theft incident also taught me valuable lessons about tenant screening. I now require references from multiple previous landlords, run thorough background checks, and include very specific language in lease agreements about property access and theft. I'll never again inherit problem tenants without doing my own due diligence. Looking back, I'm actually grateful that Carol was dumb enough to steal from me so obviously. If she'd been smarter about it or taken smaller amounts, I might never have caught her. Instead, her greed and entitlement led to her downfall and gave me ironclad evidence of her criminal behavior. The whole experience proved that patience and documentation can be much more effective than immediate confrontation. By gathering evidence and using my leverage as her landlord, I was able to get complete satisfaction without any of the risks that come with direct conflict. Carol learned the hard way that actions have consequences, especially when you're stealing from someone who has power over your housing situation. She thought she was clever enough to get away with petty theft, but she ended up facing criminal charges, financial ruin, and the loss of her affordable housing. Meanwhile, I ended up with better security, better tenants, and the satisfaction of knowing that justice was served. Sometimes the best revenge really is just letting people destroy themselves through their own bad choices. The last I heard through the neighborhood grapevine, Carol and Bob were still struggling financially and had moved out of state. Apparently, the criminal record from the insurance fraud conviction was making it difficult for Carol to find decent employment. Once again, the consequences of her own actions were catching up with her. As for me, I'm still happily living in my house with my classic Mustang safely secured in the garage. The new security system gives me complete peace of mind, and my current tenants are exactly the kind of people I want living on my property. Every time I fill up my fuel containers now, I remember Carol's midnight visits to my garage and smile. She was so focused on stealing a few gallons of gas that she ended up losing everything that mattered to her. In the end, her petty greed cost her far more than she ever stole from me. That's the thing about entitled people like Carol. They're so convinced they deserve whatever they want that they never stop to consider the risks of their behavior. They think they're too smart to get caught or too important to face consequences. But eventually, reality catches up with them. I learned that sometimes the best way to deal with thieves and troublemakers is to give them exactly enough rope to hang themselves. Carol did all the hard work of destroying her own life. I just documented it and made sure she faced the appropriate consequences. The whole saga from start to finish took about 18 months, but it was worth every minute of planning and patience. Carol got exactly what she deserved, and I got something much more valuable than a few gallons of stolen fuel. I got justice, better security, and the knowledge that crime definitely doesn't pay when you're dumb enough to steal from your own landlord. The next one is a pro-revenge story. This happened in the early 2010s before the advancement of technology in video editing and content creation. I was hired as a content creator for a university that wanted to leverage YouTube to kickstart their branding campaign. The pay was low, roughly $2,200. And in those days, there were not that many video content creators around, and the process usually took a long time from start to finish. I was hired, and on my second day, my manager presented my KPI of 85.3, 10-minute videos in 52 weeks, which was impossible for a one-man team in those days. This meant I had to do the scripting, producing, casting talents, shooting videos, composing music. They were too cheap to pay for a royalty-free music subscription, and editing, all of which I had to use my own equipment and software because their cameras and computers were so old. They simply couldn't handle the strain of even doing things in 720p, much less 1080p. I tried to let my manager know, but she just smiled encouragingly, telling me to give it a try, assuring me if the videos were good, the quantity would not be what she focused on. Hearing this, I agreed to give it a try. My manager treated me well in the first month, however. One day when she found out I was a smoker, her attitude changed overnight. A colleague had actually done a facepalm when I told her about it, and she let me know that the manager hated smokers and often advocated to get them fired. She started nitpicking me on everything, from smelling like cigarette smoke after my breaks, coming in 5, 10 minutes late despite doing more than 4 hours of overtime daily, not being contactable during break times, the list goes on. But I soldiered on because I just wanted to do the work and do it well. 5 months in, I was called into the director's office where I saw my manager putting on her best displeased but gleeful face, and I felt my stomach drop. The director told me that she was disappointed because she had heard that I was falling behind on my work, and it was already halfway through the year and I had only completed 30 out of my 85 videos. I tried to explain that I had been working my butt off on these videos. I literally worked 6 days out of the week, over 60 hours just to do what needed to be done. And that being a one-man army made things impossible. And also the fact that the videos I had put up grossed the highest views ever on their YouTube page. I also recounted how my manager said that she was looking for quality videos over quantity. The director dismissed this and stated that the KPI was simply 85 videos in a year, and since it was almost half a year in with my numbers at less than half, she felt it prudent to cut the cord early. I asked how would they even meet the KPI if they were to fire me. Now my manager had snorted, saying, "We'll find a professional production house to finish your work." The director had given her an odd look, but nodded in her support nonetheless, telling me, "You don't need to worry, manager will get the job done." That was when a light bulb went off in my head. Seeing as I was the content professional in the office, one of my jobs was to keep a database of production houses to use in the event we needed to do a shoot that required more resources, and I was sure that they would be using the production houses in my database as my manager had no contacts in the production industry. So, I changed the contact numbers and messed up all the emails on all of the entries except one. The one, I had a friend working as a junior director, not an assistant director, but a director assigned to smaller video projects. I gave him a call and told him of my plan, and sure enough, within 2 days, they were called to come in to pitch. I told him that I had a plan that was a win-win for us. It would instantly help him and put him on the fast track to a director position by bringing in that much business to his production house, and it would also benefit me financially. I would teach him exactly how to pitch to win over the boss and the director, and in turn, his company would pay me a standard finder's fee of 15%. He agreed instantly and immediately put me on the line with his general manager, who, upon realizing this was to be 6 months of work for a high 6-digit payout, instantly agreed and drew up a contract. As it turns out, after I gave them a metaphorical step-by-step playbook, They were the perfect fit, somehow understanding the needs and style of the university, as well as the sort of themes the university wanted to feature. The director and my former boss were amazed that my friend's production house was so familiar with their content that they signed them up on the spot. Now, even back then, using a production house back then was not cheap. Each video that they produced could cost double to triple my monthly salary, given that they had specialized people for each function: producer, director, director of photography, gaffer, sound person, video editor, assistant director, production assistants, etc. But this meant that they could complete a video every 2-3 days. So yes, they produced 50 videos in a span of 4 months for over 100 months of my salary, and I sat back and collected the healthy 15%, which was about 15 months of my salary. This allowed me to put money aside for a holiday, and the rest to further my studies with a respected film school overseas. I thought my plan ended here and I had gotten back at my former bosses, but to my surprise, I received a call from my colleague while I was holidaying in Bali one day. This was the same colleague who had facepalmed when I told her that my manager had found out that I was a smoker. She told me that my former manager had been fired and my director given a massive blasting by the chancellor of the university. The content creation project, which I was hired for, was only given a budget equating to about 1.5 years of my salary, and they had exceeded that budget by over 10 times. My former manager was so desperate to ensure that her content creation project could be completed that she had thrown caution to the wind, paying anything to get the job done so that she could show my director that she had completed the project and had approved the massive spend without getting consent from the director. So that is how I got my friend a super fast promotion to a full director in his production house, and 1 year of pay after getting unfairly fired from my job. The next one is a malicious compliance story. For context, I work as a salesman in a wine store. It's not a normal wine and liquor place, it's a curated selection, meaning we pick out all the wine that we sell. This is irregular in retail. Most selections are curated by the distributor. As a result, all the employees have to really know their crap, and we are regularly asked a lot of questions and need to give detailed and honest answers. Our customer base really likes us, and new customers are either pleasantly surprised by the experience or endlessly mad we don't carry their name brand thing they like. Damn you, whispering angel. The other day, a couple came into the store at the recommendation of a friend. I will call them Asher and Blake. Asher was very excited and was super happy when we had the bottles they had taken pictures of at a party the other day. Blake, however, immediately started making comments like, "Really, that one?" or "That tasted awful, you want that?" Asher was clearly a little upset at this, but I gathered this was just a normal dynamic in their relationship, as it was brushed off rather quickly. After we put those bottles aside, they tell me they are going to do a garden party since it's warm. Nice sunny day, light apps and snacks, average spring party. So they ask me to recommend some wine, and I start going through the store and showing them some options. I hit all the big guys: Loire and New World Sauvignon Blancs, Provençal Roses, Albarinos, Toscanas, and New World Pinot Noir for the red drinkers. A good selection for the food they had described. Well, Blake did not think so. Every suggestion I made was met with a counter. I show them a nice floral, unoaked, white burgundy. "I think we should do Chablis." "Pinot Noir, don't you think Pinot is too heavy?" "Sauvignon Blanc, too sweet." "Albarino, too heavy." At this point, I'm at a loss. I'm running out of stuff to give Blake, so I scale up a bit, offer some fuller-bodied wines. Not great pairing to the event or the food, but not destructive. Blake is still not happy. Asher is clearly pissed at this point. They've been holding their tongue, but every denial makes their face a darker shade of red until they finally pop. Asher apologizes to me and says they are going to go with my suggestions and tells Blake that they can pick out a bottle they want because clearly they are not willing to listen to me. I go through and put their cart together, listen to them argue a bit at the register, and then check Blake out after Asher storms out of the store. Whatever, I'm free of it. Asher is a saint for dealing with B. It's done. It was not done. The next morning when I show up, Blake is waiting for me with the 3 bottles they picked. Got 3 of the same thing. "The wine is off," Blake says, holding the bottle out like it's some sort of weird bug. I tell them that, yeah, it happens sometimes. I'll check it out. To be clear, it is rare that the wine is actually off. Most of the time, the customer just doesn't like it. It doesn't hurt us, and we want the business, so we always accept exchanges and just agree that it wasn't right. The customer has been right twice that I have seen, and I was one of the 2 customers, compromised cork. So I open up the store with an impatient Blake standing over me before finally taking the bottle. I kid you not, this thing is like 80 degrees. It is hot. The sun hasn't been out long enough to do this either, so I'm pretty confident they did something to it. Anyway, I pour myself a glass and taste it. Even through the mire of hot booze, I can tell it's good. All of the flavors I expect stand out. It smells fine. No evidence of oxidizing or mildew. Good bottle. Feeling petty, I tell Blake as much, wanting them to admit that they just don't like the wine. Blake turns a bit red and says as much. Good. Let's pick something else out then. Where are your Super Tuscans? Blake asks. I eyed up because this is the perfect chance to duck with them. We have 2 true ones in the store. One is a very accessible price, pretty standard, Sangiovese, Cab Franc, Merlot, Syrah. Really nice and medium-bodied. Wouldn't be too bad for the garden party, but still on the heavier end. The other? Expensive as hell, Syrah and Cab Franc. It is the inkiest, blackest, heaviest wine you could imagine. I love it, but I think it might kill anyone who drinks it in 80-degree weather. Well, I give Blake the heavy one. Blake, of course, is in love when I tell them about it. Big, bold flavors, heavy, crushes the flavor of whatever you eat with it. Perfect for Blake. They get 3 to replace the bottles they returned and end up spending an extra $130 even with the cost of the refunded wine deducted. Now, I know I'm way more sensitive to wine and food than others are, but this was perfect. Even somebody who's demolished their palate with years of cigar smoking would be able to tell that wine is awfully paired. I'm happy knowing Blake is going to get some weird looks from their guests and a tongue lashing from Asher, and Blake is happy with the bottle of grape-based olive oil they now own. Compliance given maliciously. Anyway, thank you for watching.